I'll now continue with our discussion of how conservatives can view the authorship of the Pentateuch. We presented the case for the Mosaic authorship, but there are problems with that view that forces us to modify it. First of all, the text of Genesis itself is silent. It never says that Moses wrote Genesis. And it's doubtful that Moses wrote the account of his own death in Deuteronomy 34. And there's also evidence of post-Moses editing. For example, it refers to Dan in Genesis 14:14, that Abram chased certain kings of the east all the way to Dan. Well, Moses could not have referred to the city as Dan because in his day it was called Laish. The Danites conquered it, and it was the name was changed from Laish to Dan in Judges chapter 18, long after Moses' death. And so that implies that this statement must have been made after the time of the Judges. There's a statement about Edomite kings, and that these reigned before an Israelite king reigned. Well, why would Moses make that kind of statement? Rather, this was written by somebody for whom it was assumed that Israelite kings were reigning. And thus it's after the time of David and Solomon and the rise of the monarchy that this statement would have been made. There's other little indications of post-Mosaic editing. Reference to the Chaldeans in Genesis 11:31. Chaldean is a late term that would not have been known by Moses or was not occupied by Chaldeans at the time of Moses. The earliest evidence for Chaldeans showing up in history is around 850 BC, centuries after Moses, though Ur was occupied by Chaldeans later on in history. And so this reference to Chaldeans implies a date sometime in the monarchy, around the 8th century or so, when Ur ceased to be an important city, and you would add the expression of the Chaldeans to distinguish that Ur from an Ur up in Syria. Another indication of post-Mosaic editing, the land of Ramses in Genesis 47:11, seems to be anachronistic since Pharaoh Ramses is in the 13th century, well after the time of the patriarchs. Moreover, Ramses may well be after the time of Moses. If you date things from 1 Kings chapter 6:1, it says Solomon began building the temple 480 years after the Exodus. Well, if you take those numbers literally, that would place the Exodus in the 1400s BC, whereas Ramses lived in the 1200s. So that, again, looks like an updating of geographic terms for a later audience. Terms like Arameans and Philistines also seems to be late. Arameans are first mentioned in Assyrian inscriptions in the 12th century BC. Philistines are first mentioned around 1200 BC. And yet Genesis refers in the time of the patriarchs to Arameans and Philistines, who what we might call Proto-Arameans. Proto-Arameans would be really what at the time would have been called Amorites. Laban is called an Aramean. And Philistines would be Proto-Philistines who came from this place called Caphtor. And they would be Caphtorites who later came to be called Philistines, though in Genesis, at the time of the patriarchs, they would not have been. This implies a first millennium dating for Genesis. So this leads to what I call the modified traditional view. The modified traditional view says this: 1. Moses wrote all the laws as stated. 2. Moses wrote some narratives. Might have even written the first draft of what became Genesis, using earlier traditions. but there has been post-Mosaic editing of the Pentateuch, updating geographic names and people groups so that later audiences could understand what was being referred to, updating the narratives for later audiences, and the narrator's voice would be an editor of Mosaic material and not simply Moses, especially true in Deuteronomy, where the editor seems to be a distinct voice from that of Moses. Why edit this material? To make it more relevant and clear for later readers. Or for the Jews in the first millennium would have been an obscure term, since it was no longer a major city and could be confused with an Ur up in Syria. But all educated people knew where the Chaldeans lived. They lived in Babylonia. And so adding of the Chaldeans clarified things for that later audience. It seems to me that this modified traditional view gives the most satisfactory approach to the question of the authorship of the Pentateuch. It accounts for more data than any of the other views, and it accepts what the New Testament has to say about Moses having something to do with the Pentateuch. This ends our discussion of the documentary hypothesis and the question of the authorship of the Pentateuch.